But creating everyone at once as believers would imply that God would know something about what their life would have been like had they lived before believing. What's up? This is Bobby Conway with CrossExamined. Recently on Pastor's Perspective, a nationally syndicated radio show that I co-host, we had an atheist caller who shared what led him to become an apostate. His big contention with Christianity was God's omniscience. To him, given an all-knowing God, he couldn't understand why God didn't exclusively create only those whom he knew would freely believe, instead of creating those whom he knew would freely reject him and consequently spend an eternity in hell separated from him. That's a good question, and it warrants an answer. While it's much easier to imagine a possible world where God created everyone as believers, that is, if they were bereft of free will, like an automaton of sorts. But the project gets much harder if we are to imagine a possible world whereby everyone freely believes. The caller's question was about what philosophers refer to as God's middle knowledge. This is the knowledge that God has regarding counterfactuals, that is, what people would do in given different circumstances that they might be placed in. Take this world, for example, the actual world. In this world, whereby you and I freely believed, it came packaged with its own unique set of circumstances, all of which shaped who we are, ultimately leading us to freely believe. But now, let's imagine together, not this world, not the actual world, but another world, a possible world. In that world, what would happen to our fate there as believers? It's hard to say. For example, if you shake up the formula, create another world where only those who exist freely believe, it's quite possible, given that world and its circumstances, that we may not have believed. It was this world, the actual world, whose circumstances all combined to lead to our eventual belief. Philosopher William Lane Craig rightly notes in one of his questions of the week regarding this same topic, stating, you can't just pluck people out of the actual world and stick them in another world and be guaranteed that they would make the same choices, end quote. Besides these considerations, let's continue to tease this thought out a bit more. The idea of a possible world in which everyone freely believes. Well, what would that kind of world even look like? For example, join me for a momentary thought experiment. How would humanity arrive on the world scene? Let's say God creates an original pair, like an Adam and Eve. But this new pair in this possible world, God would know that they would never sin. But then what happens beyond them? If they are charged with populating the planet, as in the case of the Adam and Eve from the actual world, how can we guarantee, once all the various pairs start breeding, that all of their future descendants would also freely believe and not sin? I don't think we could know that. Just take the Adam and Eve from the actual world, created and placed in a perfect setting called Eden. And yet they freely rebelled. And then there are their first kids, Cain and Abel. And we all know how quickly things got jacked up. I'd imagine Adam was like, hey kids, we need to follow God's plan. Let me tell you what happened to mom and me for not obeying. But no, free will comes with a price tag. From Adam and Eve's first set of kids, we've got murder. It's as if hearing the stories from mom and dad about the good old days in Eden didn't do anything to prevent Cain from murder. Sin was crouching at the door, and that says something. Now perhaps he could have bypassed a first pair and just created everyone who would freely believe at once. But creating everyone at once as believers would imply that God would know something about what their life would have been like had they lived before believing. For example, to create people as believers already, the believer would need a way to know that he freely believed. So perhaps the scenario would be that God could have created us, as it's been implied before, to wake up in heaven, so to speak, but then sort of upload a narrative of information into our head of the way we would have lived had we lived, even though we never lived that way. Well, that's a real problem. That would make God deceptive. It would base our relationship with him on an illusion. On this view, according to Craig, our whole past life is an illusion. Your loves, your accomplishments, your times of worship, it's all illusory. I'm persuaded that it would be incompatible with the goodness of God to do such a thing. It's deceitful, and God is true and not a deceiver. He treats people with respect as moral agents distinct from himself and allows them the freedom to make decisions, end quote. Now, given all the above, perhaps the other option is for God to have never created anyone at all to avoid the problem of hell. But then we should ask, is it fair to those who would freely believe to be robbed of the chance to know God at the expense of those who would reject him? Or someone might say, but why not just create humanity and forego creating hell altogether? But we might wonder, what then of justice? Others might say, okay, but do we need an eternal hell to satisfy God's justice? Why not annihilationism, which would allow someone to experience God's justice for their temporal life of sin, but not eternal justice? Well, that's a belief option that plenty of Christians hold to. Some further wonder, yet how can hell be just if one receives eternal punishment for a temporal life of sin? Again, I'd leverage Craig's reflection on this where he said, the reason the punishment goes on forever is because the sinning goes on forever. It's not like we sin less in hell. No, we would sin more with God's general grace removed and our sin nature operating in full throttle. So all things considered, I think our job as believers is to be faithful to Scripture and what it teaches. And as we are, we should remember that God is just, loving, and not willing that any should perish. And when all is said and done, we can know that no one will be without excuse. In the meantime, we can agonize about the topic, but we can agonize while on mission and while leaning into God from a posture of trust.